A soldier knocks on a farmhouse door in rural France. It's winter 1793. The farmer has grain stored, barely enough to get his family through spring. The soldier has a requisition order, a musket, and the legal authority of the Committee of Public Safety in Paris. The farmer has nothing. This scene played out thousands of times across 40 départements of revolutionary France, and the people running it called themselves liberators. Let's see how wrong they were. There's something interesting about colonial systems. They almost never call themselves that, right? No one's going to go around and say, this is a colonial system. They come with justifications, a mission, a reason why the extraction is actually for everyone's benefit. And the French revolutionary government was no different. By late 1793, Paris and other major cities were facing serious food shortages. War had disrupted supply chains. Inflation was running wild, so people couldn't afford anything. The government needed to get hold of some grain, and it needed it fast. The solution they landed on was a paramilitary force. The Armée Révolutionnaire, authorized by 2 decrees, one in June 1793 and another in September 1793. A third order, drafted by the military strategist Carnot himself, gave them their ways of working. These weren't small units either. They eventually operated across approximately 40 départements, from major urban centres like Lille, Metz, Lyon, Bordeaux, Nantes and Toulouse, all the way into rural districts like the Oise, the Gonesse and the Aveyron. Sorry, my French pronunciation is not great. The stated mission was to secure food supplies and to enforce the law against hoarders and counter-revolutionaries. In practice, that meant showing up with villagers with guns and leaving with their grain. The Committee of Public Safety is running France at this particularly chaotic stage of the French Revolution, and they're overseeing this whole thing. The Committee of General Security was also involved. This wasn't a rogue militia, it was state policy, as much as it could be during the Revolution. So before we get into what actually happened on the ground, understand the architecture. This was a legally authorized, centrally directed system for moving food from rural areas to cities, backed by the threat of force, and operating across nearly half the country. That's not a wartime emergency measure that got out of hand. That's a decision. And decisions have at least a little bit of logic, right? The question is, whose logic was it? To justify an extractive system, you need a story about why the people being extracted from deserve it, or at least why they can't be trusted to manage their own resources. The British had it in India and many other places, the Belgians had it in the Congo, and the French revolutionary government had it too. They just called it Enlightenment. The language used by revolutionary commanders and Paris newspapers to describe rural populations was consistent and kind of specific. Peasants were fanatical, superstitious, they were ignorant. They were also egoist, selfish. One commander described rural resistance as being founded on the credulity of women and religious prejudices. The soldiers, often coming from urban places themselves, by contrast saw themselves as enlightened town dwellers. Peasants were called selfish monsters, and this is a direct quote. Enemies of the fatherland more bitter than the Austrians. Think about that. The people growing the food were considered more dangerous than the foreign armies trying to invade. In Lyon, after the city was retaken from rebels, the outside administrators brought in to govern it were described in contemporary accounts as possessing, and again, this is a direct quote from the historical record, the mentality of colonial functionaries, for whom no word was too scornful to describe the stupidity of the native. That word, native, is doing a lot of work there, because it's exactly the word the European colonial administrators would use for the next 150 years to describe the people whose land they were governing. The ideology wasn't incidental to the extraction, it was the main part. You can't send armed men into villages to take food without a story that makes that feel justified. The story the revolution chose to tell was, we are reason, they are superstition. We are the nation, they are the obstacle. That story didn't come from nowhere, and it didn't stay in France. But ideology only gets you so far. What actually happened when the soldiers arrived? So here's how colonial extraction actually works at the ground level. And this is true whether you're talking about rubber in the Congo or grain in rural France. The quota isn't set based on what the local population can spare. It's set based on what the extracting power needs. The gap between these two is where conflict and death arises. Take the Oise department. Paris demanded 2,000 sacks of flour per week from this region. Not a one-time emergency levy, per week as an ongoing obligation. In the Les Andelys district, the quota was set at 400 weight per ploughland for the city of Rouen. The specific cantons of Lyon-la-Forêt, Charleval, and Menville were included in these requisitions. The problem? Those cantons only had enough grain to feed themselves for 6 to 7 months of the year. They were being taxed on surplus they didn't even have. In Aveyron, the presence of the army caused what contemporaries described as a kind of famine. The soldiers drained whatever limited local supplies existed, and the people who lived there were left with the consequences. In Alsace, the violence of the Bavarian army sent thousands of people fleeing for their lives to rival nations. Thousands of French people crossing the international border to escape a French revolutionary army in France. Local officials who pushed back didn't fare well. The mayor of Charus was arrested for failing to prosecute people who attacked soldiers. The mayor of Viarme was removed from office. The entire municipality of Noyon was illegally arrested by a commander named Gasson on the grounds that they had monarchist leanings, a charge that was essentially impossible to disprove and easy to apply to anyone who got in the way. This is what some people call stability through harm. and it's what it looks like in practice. The system in Paris was functioning, bread was reaching the cities, the revolutionary government was surviving, and the machine that made all of this possible was setting extraction quotas above the levels people needed to live. And those people in those rural areas had no political power to resist. The harm wasn't a side effect, it was the way everything had to work. Now here's where it gets complicated, because not everyone in Paris thought this was fine. One of the weird things about colonial history, in my opinion, is that the people running these systems weren't monsters who didn't know better. It's that many of them knew exactly what they were doing, argued against it privately, and then did it anyway because the political cost of stopping was higher than the human cost of continuing. Inside the revolutionary government, there were real concerns about what the armies were doing. The Peak section, one of the radical Parisian political clubs, warned that the force would become a Praetorian Guard or military government. They were worried about a coup, not about the peasants, but the concern was real. Within the Committee of Public Safety, two senior figures, Robert Lindet and Barrère, feared the army was going to become a military government. They put this on the record. Robespierre himself initially championed the army as a people's army to restrain the aristocracy, and he later turns against it, not because of what it was doing to rural communities, but because he believed it was becoming an instrument of his political rivals' personal ambition. The commander-in-chief of the army was a man named Ronsin. Under him, regional commanders like Perrin in Lyon, Bonafou in the Haute-Garonne, and Gramont in the Vendée ran their own operations with significant local discretion, which meant the violence and extraction were not uniform, but they were consistent in which direction they went. The system was eventually disbanded in the spring of 1794, not because it was causing famine in the countryside, but because it had become a political liability in Paris. The debate about the armies was never really about the people being harmed. It was about who in Paris could keep control of it. That's a pattern that shows up again and again in colonial history. The big cities argue about the administration of the empire, the morality of specific methods, the careers of specific officials. The people at the other end of the gun are background noise. But in this case, they weren't really background noise, were they? They were people with their own identity, their own language, their own understanding of what was being done to them. Here's a simple test for whether something's actually a colonial dynamic as opposed to just bad policy. Does the population on the receiving end experience it as an outside force imposing alien values on their community? Because if they do, if they use words like outsiders and strangers and frame their resistance in terms of local identity against an invading culture, that tells you something the official documents won't. In the Maupertuis region of the so-called Vendée Brigade, the rural hinterland east of Paris, peasants rose up with a specific cry. Long live the Catholic religion. We want our curés. This wasn't a tax revolt, it was a community defending its cultural identity against an urban power that had abolished the church. Rural populations consistently framed the revolutionary laws as biased towards the towns. The soldiers were called étrangers, outsiders, foreigners, even when they were technically French. The distinction being made wasn't national, it was civilizational, in the same way that colonial subjects distinguished between themselves and their administrators. Language reinforced the divide in both directions. In the Ariège, revolutionary repression was directed against what officials called a foreign patois, the local dialect. So language wasn't just a communication barrier, it was evidence of backwardness, of not being French enough, and the need of correction. In the Versailles district, some revolutionary units were themselves noted for speaking au vin patois and scarcely understanding French, which tells you something interesting. The divide wasn't cleanly urban versus rural in terms of actual people. It was urban versus rural in terms of which identity the system rewarded and which ones it punished. The text describing Lyon's population used the phrase colonisation explicitly. The city was colonised by étrangers, and the result is what we could call the hatred of the townsman for the countryman, as a feature of the occupation, not as an accident of who was in charge. The people living through this didn't need a historian to tell them what was happening. They called the soldiers outsiders. They framed their resistance in terms of local identity and religion against an alien urban power. They fled across borders. The colonial dynamic wasn't something later scholars projected onto the revolution. These people's experience was much like people who would suffer at the hands of French and British and European colonisers in the centuries before and since. Which brings us to the question this whole video has been building towards, and the answer is going to reframe everything. Here's the interesting part. The French Revolution ends in 1799, Napoleon takes power. Within a few years, France is building one of the largest colonial empires in history. Algeria, West Africa, Indochina, the Pacific. And the people running that empire, in many cases, the intellectual and institutional descendants of the men who ran the Armée Révolutionnaire. The logic is almost identical. You have an urban centre that needs resources. You have a rural or peripheral population that has them. You have a gap in political power that means the extraction side can set the terms. You have an ideological framework, civilization, enlightenment, the nation, progress, that makes the extraction feel like a gift rather than theft. The specific techniques developed inside France, the requisition quota, the armed enforcement unit, the removal of local officials who resist, the framing of cultural difference as backwardness requiring correction. These aren't invented fresh when France arrived in Algeria in 1830. They're already in institutional memory. Historians of colonialism spend a lot of time asking where the colonial mindset came from. How did European administrators learn to think of subject populations as natives? How did they develop the administrative reflex of treating local resistance as criminality rather than a legitimate grievance? How did they get comfortable with extraction that exceeded what people needed? The answer that this history suggests is they practiced, not necessarily overseas, although some of that happened in Haiti first, but at home too, on their own rural population. The countryside of France was, for a brief and brutal period in the 1790s, the laboratory where the colonial system was tested before it was exported. The French Revolution didn't just inspire colonial independence movements, and it did. From Haiti to Latin America to Vietnam, revolutionary leaders quoted it directly. It also, in the same time, in the same years, built the operational template that colonial powers would use to suppress those same movements for the next 2 centuries. The liberty and the tyranny weren't opposites. They came from the same place. They were built by the same hand, and some of the first people to suffer from it weren't always African or Asian. They were in the regions of France. They were in Oise and Aveyron and the hills above Lyon, watching soldiers walk away with the grain